middle daughter, now a grown woman and a regular candomblé participant, no longer got possessed by unwanted spirits. The health of the whole family had improved. Once a constant complainer about her ailments, Carolina was cheerier in 1980. Alberto contributed his persistent slight afternoon cough to years of Pack-a-Day cigarette smoking, which he had given up in 1977. He kept his slim and fit-looking physique despite his 57 years and his retirement from fishing. His hearing was failing noticeably, and his eyesight, which had troubled him in 1973, continued to be a problem. Psychologically, Alberto exuded a new confidence. When presenting me to an immigrant neighbor and friend, he remarked, "You remember my boss, don't you?" Alberto was openly acknowledging and addressing years of gossip about our relationship. Villagers had always suspected that I paid Alberto for being a regular informant, which I never did, except with occasional presents and departure gifts, until I hired him as a field assistant in 1973 and 1980. Alberto had grown accustomed and felt entitled to his own moderate success. He was less threatened by envy than before. All Arambeperos were now more familiar with economic success and conspicuous consumption, and these lifestyle changes were often the result of contacts with outsiders. One afternoon in 1980, as Alberto and I were looking at boats beached for repairs near the fish stores, he pointed to a large vessel that belonged to a man from Salvador and joked with me, in plain hearing of a neighbor, "You're going to buy that boat from me, aren't you?" What a contrast with the 1960s, when he had often complained that co-villagers were making him uncomfortable by accusing him of taking money from me to tell their secrets. In 1964 and 65, I had often wondered why Alberto sometimes didn't appear for our nightly chat. I later learned that he was avoiding me after particularly disturbing gossip attacks. Even in 1973, Alberto had avoided confrontations with village gossip about our relationship. By 1980, his self-confidence had grown immensely. Of the four people discussed in this chapter, Alberto might be considered the most typical in certain ways. In contrast to Dora, once stigmatized as a rapariga, or village prostitute, and to Fernando and Tome, captain owners, Alberto belonged to no deviant or statistically restricted social category. For about 30 years he had been an ordinary fisherman. Like many others, he had reduced his fishing and then abandoned it in response to new opportunities. His parents and grandparents were longtime residents, having been born either in Arambepe or in one of the estates a few kilometers to the west. His grandparents had been among Arambepe's original settlers. Alberto remembered a great-grandmother who told him stories of her life as a slave. Like the other three, Alberto would be considered black in the United States, but his skin was the darkest of the four. My records show that he used various racial terms for himself. Marino Escuro, which is dark brunette, Escuro, dark, and even Preto, black on occasion. Despite his more typical economic role and native birth, Alberto's individuality stood out in obvious ways. As a youth, he had suffered an accident that left him with a minor but easily seen physical disability. Another aspect of Alberto's personality soon became even more apparent to me. This was his interest in teaching. In the 1960s, he often mentioned his friendship with the learned German priest who had married one of the landowners. He took me to the man's apartment in Salvador, and I saw Alberto was indeed friendly with the elderly man and his two sons, both university graduates. Although Alberto was barely literate, having obtained only limited schooling available locally during his boyhood, he valued education. He and Carolina had burdened themselves with the expense of educating their oldest daughter, Maria Jose, in Idapoan, and their youngest daughter, Wanda, was taking advantage of the improved schools in Arambepe. Alberto had often told me that one member of the landowning family had become a high school teacher, and he spoke with pride of the college education of another landlord. Alberto knew that I planned to become a university professor. He appreciated the fact I found Arambepe worth studying, and he very much wanted to instruct me. Both Niles Eldridge and I found that he liked particularly to teach about fishing. He labored with both of us on maps of the ocean floor, detailing the zones where different species could be found, making sure we had the correct names of the zones, and pointing them out when we went fishing. In 1973, he went over the ocean floor map in my doctoral dissertation, chiding me for mistakes and penciling in corrections. Perhaps other anthropologists have forgotten, after long absences, as I did between 73 and 80, the specific talents and personality attributes of a particular informant that originally led the anthropologist to value him or her especially. In 1980, I found myself rediscovering the full range of Alberto's special qualities. A key marker of a good informant was Alberto's habit of admitting when he didn't know the answer to a particular question. Other informants would simply give me a wrong answer. Alberto would go out that evening or the next day and discreetly check out the point. Despite, or perhaps because of, his failing vision and hearing, Alberto had always paid close attention to what he both saw and heard. Through observation that went on around him, he built a broad knowledge of village life, and he had a good memory. I was also struck by the accuracy of his estimates and figures, particularly since other people who should have known particular facts better than he did were much less accurate. Accuracy, memory, knowledge, attentiveness, and willingness to admit lack of knowledge are qualities that make a good informant. Alberto had these in abundance. A final point, Alberto considered his village story well worth telling, and he wanted to make sure I got it right. Unlike others who insisted on directing my questions about their society back at me, or their camels in the United States, Alberto pondered even my most naive questions and usually made a sincere attempt to answer them. In retrospect, I realized my association with Alberto was no accident, no chance throwing together of compatible souls. Through Niles Eldridge, I discovered Alberto. On the other hand, through Niles, Alberto had also found me. In a community of outsiders, Alberto was the native-born participant observer, the teacher searching for a student, probably as determined to teach as Niles and I were to learn. This book therefore reflects joint accomplishment of a common goal, Alberto's and mine, to bring Arambepe's story to the outside world. I met Dora, who was born in Arambepe in 1937, 2 years before I met Alberto. Because Betty Wagley Cotta got to know her even better than I've drawn on Betty's knowledge and a published article for material in this discussion. Dora, our employee during each visit to Arambepe, stands out in my memory as an exuberant, sentimental woman with a strong sense of family, a domain in which until the 1970s she had little success. Unlike Alberto, an excellent informant, Dora was never a very good one. Often she grew impatient with our questions and cut them off, saying she didn't know things it was obvious she did. One trait she shared with Alberto was a dislike of gossip, and she usually liked to enlighten us about the soap operatic details of other people's lives. Neither did Alberto, but he always tried hard to answer factual questions. Dora did love to visit people. When we planned short trips outside Arambepe, she often asked to come along. In 1980, she still remembered a trip she and her then 4-year-old son, whose congenital heart condition killed him at age 13, had made with us to Kamkari in 1962. There, the boy, Dora's firstborn, had met his father for the first time. Earlier, Dora had lived a few months in Kamakari with the boy's father, whom she had met while working as a servant in a Salvador suburb. She had abandoned him following abuse and rivalry with another woman. Although she was normally a reluctant and frustrating informant, Dora did often help us by facilitating, telling people that we wanted to talk with them, arranging meetings, accompanying us, and introducing us to strangers. For example, when Betty told her in 1980 that she was interested in talking to the nuns and the candomblé people of Coronas, Dora wanted to go right over. Visiting was her joy. Our host could answer the questions. During our 1980 visit, Dora reported several times, "I've had a feeling lately my Americans would be coming." Whereas Alberto needed us to satisfy his wish to teach, Dora had continuing material needs. She had lost the only house she'd ever owned. She wanted a new one, a home of her own for a growing family, and she was determined we were going to help her get it. From our first through almost our last conversation in 1980, she insisted on this until she got what she wanted. Persistence was another of her traits, which is why she always managed to arrange meetings with hard-to-contact people. From the mid-1960s through the early 1970s, when Dora began living with her common-law spouse, an immigrant who worked as an ordinary fisherman, she had been one of a dozen village women classified as a village prostitute. This uniquely stigmatized category lost its significance as most women, so labeled, found marital partners among the flood of men who migrated to Arambepe in the 1970s. More than the few alcoholics who were socially stigmatized as drunks, village prostitutes had been objects of local scorn. Other villagers attributed the plight of these women to mistakes on their part rather than to the economic and demographic factors that made a husbandless category inevitable. That is, the village economy gave women few ways to make a living for themselves, and the marriageable population had a surplus of females. These conditions changed during the 1970s when women's job prospects improved. Many males migrated to Arambepe and legal marriage became less frequent. In this context, the deviant status of village prostitute all but disappeared. Although the term was sometimes heard as an insult, the following discussion of how Dora got to be a rapariga and of what happened to her as that deviant category lost its salience is based largely on an article by Isabel Betty Kotak, 1977. That article applied symbolic interactions or labeling theory to Dora's case. Betty analyzes Dora's deviance in terms of Edwin Lamert's eightfold progression from primary deviation, first departure from the norm, through ultimate acceptance of deviant status and role. Dora's primary deviation, getting pregnant, occurred when she was 20. Note that her deviation was not sexual intercourse, which many young women have before elopement or marriage, but pregnancy. The obvious anatomical change removed Dora from the virgin category and motivated her to seek a mate. She joined her lover in Kamkari, but their common-law union lasted only 8 months. She moved back to Arambepe with her infant son. The ironic contrast to villagers' later view of Dora as a Rapariga seeking to live off other women's husbands, she had actually tried hard to improve her economic and social position. She had ventured into the unknown outside world. She had ventured into the unknown world outside of Arambepe, where she had obtained employment as a domestic. Like many other local women, she had an affair with an unmarried man, lighter in skin color and wealthier than most men back home. She hoped for socio-economic advance, but luck, which had contributed to the rise and fall of so many Arambeperos, was a factor in Dora's subsequent plight. An inexperienced young woman away from home, she chose the wrong man. Dora returned to Arambepe and moved into her grandmother's wattle and daub house, where her childless brother and his wife also lived. Although these people helped Dora care for her son, her chances of attracting a man had been reduced by childbirth. Young men preferred younger women than Dora and generally avoided acquiring stepchildren. The partners that Dora was able to find were losers. The father of her second son, who lived only 2 years, was an alcoholic. Following this brief affair, Dora took up with the father of her oldest surviving son, born in 1962. This was an unsuccessful fisherman, and again the union didn't last. Dora suffered further penalties and social rejection, which are common aspects of a deviant career. Her needs increased as her children grew older. Dora's brother's wife began to have children, and the support of Dora and her children became more burdensome for her brother. Dora realized that she and her children were draining resources that her brother, a non-owning captain, needed to buy his own boat. To increase her independence, she took various steps. She sought work from the few outsiders like us who filtered into Arambepe in the mid-1960s. She became more aggressive in meeting men and trying to obtain their support. She began to associate less with her brother's family and more with women like herself, unmarried females who lived alone. She flouted canons of proper female behavior by visiting the beach as the boats returned in the evenings, by staying out late on festive occasions, and by dressing garishly. In short, she began to act like a village prostitute. As a final step, in 1965, she began her first affair with a married man, a successful captain owner whose 2 sons she eventually bore. Other villagers began to regard her as someone who was depriving a legal wife and family of their rights. To make her affair a secondary wife in an informal polygamous union easier and to relieve tension in her brother's home, Dora left that household in 1966. With her consort's help, she built a wattle and daub hut, the first home of her own, in northern Arambepe. This hut was blatantly located near her consort's primary home in a neighborhood where Dora had never lived before. She was regularly abused by her lover's relatives and in-laws who lived nearby. When she fought with her lover's wife, her own relatives didn't take her side. The stigma applied to Dora had become generalized and community-wide. The label Rapariga was applied to her more often. Decent women told their children not to play with hers. Dora's relationship with her consort gradually deteriorated as he gave less and less to feed Dora and her children. She began entertaining men for money and food. This became easier as Arambepe's access to outsiders improved. But such behavior hadn't been possible when Dora lived with her brother. By 1970, Dora mainly associated with other members of the Rapariga category. She became a leader in the Rapariga group, smoothing over arguments between other members and using her facilitating skills to help them find jobs. The economic opportunities open to such women were also increasing by 1970. With Dora's support and encouragement, the Raparigas would occasionally invade male territory, visiting the beach, where they would laugh, joke, and poke fun at fishermen and fish buyers. Dora had become more aggressive and was regularly visible in domains not ordinarily open to village women. She moved at will through public space, entering stores and bars, freely interacting with outsiders, including tourists and anthropologists. By 1973, it was clear that Dora's role as Rapariga and the deviant behavior associated with it had intensified, as had her labeling by co-villagers. Dora's Rapariga status excluded her from usual female areas of social participation, normal home life, adequate diet, and the possibility of advancing in socioeconomic status through a husband, the likelihood of good health, legitimacy, inheritance rights for her children. This exclusion caused Dora much anguish, especially with the deaths of several of her children. Still, as is generally true of membership in deviant social categories, Dora's role as a member of a subculture opened compensatory areas of social participation normally closed to ordinary women. For example, along with other Raparigas, Dora became active in candomblé in the mid-1970s. Members of any social system are concerned about deviant people only if and when they are well-established deviant roles, and the role of Rapariga was disappearing from Arambepe in 1980. Dora's social status had risen because her common-law union with an immigrant fisherman had lasted several years, but her lifestyle hadn't improved dramatically. Like other ordinary fishermen in 1980, Dora's husband received low wages. His employer was a wealthy store owner and local entrepreneur, from whom Dora took weekly cash advances to be repaid, they hoped, out of the next catch. Dora regarded her partner as a good man. She ignored his excessive weekend drinking and stressed that he was a kind father to their 2 young children, including Dora's only daughter, and 2 or 3 sons from previous unions. With her husband's earnings, Dora had planned to convert her Wattle and Daub straw roof hut into a brick house, but a former neighbor had seized her land, fencing it off and calling it his own when she tore down the hut to start building the new house. Dora was dubious about winning a court case against him. In the meantime, she had temporarily lived with another brother whose wife she frequently argued. Her 1980 home was a hut loaned by her aunt. The lives of Dora and her sons had been spent in tiny hovels with mud wall parasites, bare earthen floors, and leaky insect-infested palm frond roofs. By 1980, Dora was desperate for a home of her own to bring her family together, to have all her children around her. She felt especially sorry for her oldest son, aged 18, who slept next door in her aunt's living room, about to finish junior high school, after which he planned to enter the Army, get work papers, and eventually find a steady job. Dora's son had no classes until afternoon. Dora lamented, "Sometime he likes to sleep late because he doesn't have anything to do. My aunt calls him lazy when he does. I wish he didn't have to take that. I want a house of my own so my son can sleep late if he wants to. I wish my man and sons had steady jobs. Nowadays fishermen don't earn enough to pay the bills. People treat me funny sometimes. They look at me in a strange way. I think it's because I don't have a house, but my boys are all handsome and strong, and I have hope for the future." Dora looked to her sons, particularly the 3 oldest ones, aged 14, 15, and 18, to bring an end to her continuing poverty. Their future incomes would help her build a house on the lot we helped her buy in late August 1980. With a down payment in hand, she would make monthly payments on the balance. Since a few months before our arrival, Dora had been working in a bar recently opened in the village square by her comadre, her godmother of her second son. Her weekend wages and tips would pay off her mortgage. Dora pinned her hopes on kinship, on her son's eventual success, and on that of her comadre. Their close ritual kinship had lasted 20 years, despite the premature death of Dora's son, whose baptism had created the relationship. Recalling past taunts and exclusion, Dora said she trusted few others. She liked the brother with whom she first lived, and his wife and children, her full sister, half-sister, and some of her nieces and nephews. Besides those people, she claimed to be close to no one in Arambepe. In 1980, she locked her door each time she left her hut. "You can't trust people not to mess with your stuff," she explained. Though Dora was no longer a Rapariga, her former status had left its mark. She thought that people look at me funny, though she couldn't say exactly why. She felt cut off from most other villagers. Still in 1980, 23 years after the primary deviation of her first pregnancy, Dora, through her sons, could glimpse an end to years of poverty, miserable living conditions, and social isolation. The wish, now a more realistic hope, to escape all this was symbolized in Dora's desperation to bring her children together in a new home.